We're now at seminar number 12, and we're ready to discuss randomized clinical trials, the highest peak among the mountains of evidence-based medicine. It is worthwhile remembering that Arthur Caplan once said, "When you're talking deaths in clinical trials, mistakes are not an option." The purpose of scientific study is to discover truth in the universe and improve the human condition. Many think the randomized trial is the only way to achieve those goals, but we've already mentioned Don Berwick's informed argument that the randomized trial is not the only means to infer truth. We've discussed many other worthy study designs during the course of these seminars. We'll exclusively focus on the randomized trial during this session. It is important to point out that RCT stands for Randomized Controlled Trial as well as Randomized Clinical Trial. Many use these terms interchangeably because they both refer to the same design. For purposes of this seminar series, we have chosen to use the term randomized clinical trial because our purpose is to focus on clinical study design. If you prefer to use the term randomized controlled trial, that is entirely fine. To carry out a randomized clinical trial successfully, the investigator should use the finer approach in planning the study. This is the same approach used when developing a study question as we discussed in seminar number 4. The study should be feasible, interesting, novel, ethical, and relevant. The investigator should also remember the mnemonic PICO when designing the study. Determine the population needed to achieve the goals of the study. Explicitly define the intervention being studied. This requires consideration of the effectiveness of the intervention as well as the safety of the intervention so no subject is harmed. Explicitly define the comparison group, whether placebo or another strategy will be used to compare to the intervention, and explicitly define the outcome of interest. Here's a graphic representation from the Hulley book depicting the randomized clinical trial. A sample is selected from the population of interest. That sample is randomly allocated to the treatment or placebo arm. These are also known as the intervention or control arms, and outcomes are measured at a later time. Many journals now require investigators to follow the CONSORT guidelines when conducting a randomized trial, because some studies in the last decade were found to be done dishonestly. CONSORT stands for Consolidated Standard of Reporting Trials. The purpose is to improve the reporting of randomized clinical trials by enhancing transparency from authors. The CONSORT statement includes an easy-to-follow flow diagram and checklist, both available at the CONSORT website. Here's the CONSORT flow diagram where the 4 essential steps of a randomized trial are clearly defined: enrollment, allocation, follow-up, and analysis. Most journals now require authors to include such a flow diagram when submitting the manuscript so readers better understand the study procedure. It is important to emphasize again that all randomized trials can be broken down to 4 essential steps: enrollment, allocation, follow-up, and analysis, so consider each of these steps carefully when planning your study. Now, unfortunately, selective reporting of trials does occur. Authors and journals are naturally most enthusiastic about reports with a large positive effect. Not publishing studies with less than stellar or even negative effects is unfair to the subjects enrolled in those studies, and it distorts the evidence available for clinical decision-making. Thus, the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors issued a statement a few years ago. These member journals will require, as a condition for publication, registration in a public trials registry. Trials must register at or before the onset of patient enrollment. This is clearly defined in the author guidelines for many of the most popularly read journals with the highest impact factor. And this requirement is there in order to encourage authors to publish studies that have negative outcomes or less than stellar outcomes, so they don't suppress that data. If considering any of these journals for publication of your own research, register your trial before the first patient is enrolled to make sure your manuscript qualifies for those journals. Let's talk a few minutes about specific features of the randomized clinical trial. Randomization. This is the cornerstone of a randomized clinical trial. This is done during the allocation step, and it eliminates the influence of baseline confounders. Randomization should not be done with a flip of a coin. Instead, it should be done using a computer-generated program that is tamper-proof, so the investigator, the clinician caring for the subject, and the subject do not influence which group the subject is ultimately allocated to. blinding. This eliminates confounding during the follow-up step. It reduces biased outcome assessment. Investigators who know what treatment a subject received during follow-up evaluation can certainly bias how the outcomes and other variables are observed and measured. A double-blind study simply means neither the investigator nor the participant know what intervention occurred until the end of the trial. So what is intention to treat analysis? This means subjects are randomized according to their assigned randomization group, even if the intervention was not given or discontinued. For instance, say a subject is allocated to take study drug A, but during follow-up the subject admits not taking the drug consistently because of poor tolerance of the drug or fear. With intention to treat analysis, that subject's characteristics and outcomes are still measured, recorded, and reported. Of course, this underestimates the full intervention effect, but it does guard against other trial biases. Per protocol analysis means this is done only for subjects who completely adhere to group protocol. Now, a good study will acknowledge and consider both forms of analysis. The intention to treat analysis is a much better representation of clinical reality because we know that our patients are not 100% compliant with the treatments offered to them. So please consider the intention to treat analysis if you're carrying out a randomized trial. It is also important to mention that all adverse events should also be systematically recorded and reported in the final manuscript. So what is a crossover trial? That is where a subject receives the intervention, outcomes are then measured, and then the subject receives the placebo after an appropriate washout period and outcomes are again measured at a later time. This can also be done in the reverse order. This way the subject serves as his own control and matching between control and intervention arms is nearly perfect. What if the investigator hopes to prove the null hypothesis? Remember, most studies are designed to disprove the null hypothesis. If an investigator tries to prove truth of the null hypothesis, that can be an equivalence trial where one tries to determine whether one intervention is therapeutically similar to an accepted standard treatment. Or this can be a non-inferiority trial where one tries to determine whether one treatment is no worse than another. This is often done in cases when a new drug formulation in a class of drugs is developed, as is the case when a brand new purple pill is shown to be no different than an older purple pill. These studies rarely contribute much to scientific truth and instead continue to support the bottom line of pharmaceutical companies. Although some journals explicitly discourage those kinds of studies, many equivalence and non-inferiority studies have been successfully published in the last 10 to 15 years. So what is the major advantage of a randomized clinical trial? It is the ability to demonstrate cause and effect because the investigator has so much control of the study environment. Randomized clinical trials are terrific, but of course there are disadvantages to these types of trials, otherwise we would only see randomized clinical trials being published today. Some of those disadvantages include the following. They can be expensive to complete, they are time-consuming, they can only answer a narrow question, and there is potential harm to participants. These studies are not easy to conduct. They require a lot of coordination and planning. This single seminar session on the randomized clinical trial probably does not do that particular design complete justice, but understanding the anatomy and physiology of the other major study designs already reviewed in this program provides important context and foundation for understanding the essential elements of a randomized clinical trial. In the next seminar, we will be talking about survey studies.